Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, hosted by Eric Rostad. Join him on his 15-year journey through the immortal books. He'll share what he's learning, explore profound ideas across time and cultures, and share the one thing he always hopes to remember from each immortal book.
Well, I'm going to get a new series going here of podcast episodes where I talk about some of the early Greek philosophers. So my plan over the next month is to release a series of articles and podcast episodes where I talk about some of these early Greek philosophers that are usually referred to as the Presocratics and the Sophists. So Presocratic just simply means that they were before Socrates, and Sophist is kind of a branch of these early Greek philosophers. Last year, I started reading Plato. I started reading the dialogues of Plato, and I don't know what I was thinking beforehand, but maybe I just kind of thought in my head that Plato had come up with all these grand ideas on his own, and he's the father of philosophy, and everything started with him, and he's writing about Socrates, and so I don't know if I clearly had thought that, but I didn't know that Plato was going to be referring to so many earlier philosophers. And so as I was going through the dialogues, I realized I need to stop right now. I need to stop reading these Plato dialogues and go back and read some of these early Greek philosophers who Plato is referring to. Because one, I don't know who these people are. And then two, I don't know what their ideas are. So Plato's talking about their ideas. He's confronting their ideas. He's challenging their ideas. And I have no idea what those are, nor do I really understand them. And so that's what I'm doing right now. And it's kind of taken a life of its own. It's a bit of a rabbit trail, but it's a fun one. And I think it's one that will pay dividends and really help me when I go back to Plato later on, hopefully in the next month or so, having that knowledge of who these philosophers were and what they thought. And so then when Plato is referring to them and their ideas, I have a better context of which to understand his dialogues. So that's where I'm at right now in the project. This particular episode will be about Heraclitus, and this will be a two-part episode because for this episode, I want to focus on him as a philosopher, Heraclitus, but then also his main teachings. But there's something really interesting about Heraclitus, and it's in regards to his use of the term logos. And so I want to do a deeper dive into that. And so part two of this episode will cover that specific area. And I've got a couple books that I've just purchased that I plan to read over the next week to where I can then cover that in part two of this episode, which should come out the following week. So who was Heraclitus? So Heraclitus was from Ephesus. We know Ephesus from the Bible, from the book of Ephesians, but Ephesus is in Asia and modern-day Turkey, and that's where Heraclitus was from. He's often referred to as Heraclitus the Obscure, and that comes from, here's something that Aristotle said, "Of this account which holds forever men prove uncomprehending." So his writing was such that it was very hard to understand, and so that's why he was known as Heraclitus the Obscure. He came from an eminent family, and there's even some talk where he was potentially going to be the ruler, but he turned that down and focused more on philosophy. Let me read one thing here that's kind of an interesting story and connection. This comes from Diogenes Laertius, who wrote Lives of the Philosophers, and I'll be referring to that later on in this episode. So here we go. They say that Euripides, and again, Euripides is one of the Greek tragic playwrights. They say that Euripides gave Socrates a copy of Heraclitus's book and asked him what he thought of it. He replied, "What I understand is splendid, and so too, I'm sure, is what I don't understand, but it would take a Delian diver to get to the bottom of it," end quote. So that's Socrates talking about Heraclitus's book and saying that he didn't understand a good portion of it. And so that's quite interesting. And then also the fact that Euripides gave Socrates that book of Heraclitus. Now that would have been after Heraclitus passed away, because Heraclitus lived from 540 to 480 BC. And take those dates with a grain of salt. There's a few different references to the dates that he was alive, but that's probably a good estimate. So kind of thinking that around 500 BC is when he is writing his works. Let me read a few other kind of interesting stories, and these come from the Lives of Eminent Philosophers by Diogenes Laertius, and this is from the Loeb edition of that. So here I want to read a few different parts. The first is this: finally, he, meaning Heraclitus, he became a hater of his kind and wandered on the mountains, and there he continued to live, making his diet of grass and herbs. However, when this gave him dropsy, he made his way back to the city and put this riddle to the physicians, whether they were competent to create a drought after heavy rain. They could make nothing of this, whereupon he buried himself in a cowshed, expecting that the nauseous, damp humor would draw out of him by the warmth of the manure. But at even this was of no avail. He died at the age of 60. And I'll stop reading there. So he covered himself in manure, and that is how he died. Not the greatest way to go. And then later on, just let me read this one other part here. And this they don't know if this is true, but it's kind of a neat story connecting him to potentially the king of Persia, King Darius. So here we go. King Darius, son of Hystepes, to Heraclitus, the wise man of Ephesus, greeting. You are so this is a letter that King Darius wrote to Heraclitus. You are the author of a treatise on nature, which is hard to understand and hard to interpret. In certain parts, if it be interpreted word for word, it seems to contain a power of speculation on the whole universe and all that goes on within it, which depends upon motion most divine. And I'll stop reading there, and then I'll skip ahead to Heraclitus's response. So he says, Heraclitus of Ephesus to King Darius, all men upon earth hold aloof from truth and justice, while by reason of wicked folly they devote themselves to avarice and thirst for popularity. But I, being forgetful of all wickedness, shunning the general satiety, which is closely joined with envy, and because I have a horror of splendor, could not come to Persia, being content with little, when that little is to my mind, end quote. So Heraclitus potentially gets invited to the courts of the king of Persia, turns them down. That's not for him. So kind of just a neat connection there. So in each of these episodes about the early Greek philosophers, I want to talk about who their friends were and then also who their contemporaries were. So friends, we know that Xenophanes was another philosopher, so I'll cover him in another episode. He was Heraclitus's teacher, and so whether they were friends or not, there was at least a relationship of teacher and student there. But in terms of other friends, Heraclitus was described as arrogant and conceited, and so he probably didn't have many other friends. You kind of add to that this idea that what he was talking about was very hard to understand. So we don't get there's one other person he talks about that he respected, and that Ephesus had kicked, or the Ephesians had kicked out of Ephesus, and he gets really mad at them. So there's another possible friend there, but not many friends. But let's talk about contemporaries. So people that were alive at the same time as Heraclitus, and Pythagoras, Parmenides. Those two Greek philosophers were alive around the same time. In other areas, Lao Tzu and then Confucius and Buddha were all alive during this time. The second part of the book of Isaiah would have been compiled, or Isaiah was alive during that time. Aeschylus, the Greek playwright, was also alive, 525 to 455. So again, Heraclitus lived 540 to 480 BC, roughly. The main work that Heraclitus wrote was called On Nature, and he kept a copy of that in the Temple of Artemis, which is one of the seven wonders of the world in Ephesus. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in this episode. But that was his main work. We do not have that main work. We just have fragments of it. And the work was split into three parts. And those parts covered the universe, politics, and theology. So we lost On Nature, that complete work. But what we do have are fragments. And these are quoted by the likes of Plato, Aristotle, Marcus Aurelius, and Clement, who was a early church father, and many others. And so here's a quote from an introduction of one of the books I read by, and this statement is by James Hillman. He said, "It is mainly from philosophers, ancient writers, and church fathers that the fragments have been culled and passed on." End quote. So what survives are direct quotations of Heraclitus, reputed paraphrases, and then commentaries on what he wrote. So that's where we get what we have from Heraclitus. So we have very few fragments, and from those fragments we can try to kind of piece together an overall philosophy, but what we're relying on is these people who quoted him, and some pretty famous people who quoted him. But that's where we're getting a lot of what I'll be covering in this episode. So this episode will have two more segments. In the next segment, I'm going to cover his main ideas, and then a few of the quotes that and sayings that I thought were interesting. And then in segment 3, I'll cover the one thing and just a short conclusion. Well, I had a lot of fun preparing this episode, and I referenced 6 different books. So I've got these 6 books in front of me now. I'm going to kind of skip around in these to read different fragments and things like that as I go through segment 2 here. So his main ideas, let me just start off this segment with reading something from a book called Fragments of Heraclitus, and this is a Penguin Classics book. And this is this comes from the introduction, the first part here. Because archetypal modes of thought transcend time and place, the insights of Heraclitus are strikingly postmodern. End quote. I thought that was interesting, but just Heraclitus's ideas, we're still discussing them, and they've been discussed by many of the greatest philosophers in the world. And so, as I go through these main ideas of his, just kind of keep that in mind that they had a huge influence on the history of philosophy. So I want to cover 3 really big ideas, and then kind of a 4th one, and then I'll cover some of his sayings. So the 3 main ideas of Heraclitus are that of flux, fire, and logos. So let me just go through each of these. Flux, you probably heard this saying, you never step in the same river twice. That is Heraclitus, and that's one of his most famous sayings. The idea there being that everything is in flux, nothing is stable, and his name for this flux or process is fire, which is the next thing I'll talk about. But I want to just read a few statements here and different things that deal with this idea of flux. Here's a different translation of that, the river idea and everything being in flux. And so it's this: the river where you set your foot just now is gone. Those waters giving way to this, now this. And then in another one of the books, Jonathan Barnes is the translator, and he does an introduction, and he quotes from the Plato dialogue Cratylus here, where Plato says this: Heraclitus says somewhere that everything moves and nothing rests. In comparing what exists to a river, he says that you would not step twice into the same river. I'm going to close out this part here reading from a book called The First Philosophers, and this is what it says about flux. And then flux in relation to stability. So kind of the question being posed in this part is, did Heraclitus just think that everything was always in flux? Basically, was everything relative? Or was there a deeper truth? And what you see in the Plato dialogues too is Plato kind of talking about this idea of or asking the question, is everything in flux? Or are there forms, or is everything kind of always moving and changing? And so here's a part in this introduction here. The solution to the apparent contradiction between flux and stability may be that Heraclitus actually taught the underlying unity and stability of things at a deeper level, the level underlying flux, which is accessible to divine reason. The river is single, despite its flux. Dying and living are a single continuum. And I'll stop reading there. But yeah, just kind of an interesting thing in discussion there of how much did Heraclitus think that everything was always in flux, or were there some solid points as well? And from the fragments, you can see a bit of both of those things. The second big idea is that of fire, and you might have even heard of Heraclitean fire, and that term is used quite often. And one of Heraclitus's fragments, it says that all things are constituted from fire and resolve into fire. And so let me read another part of this. This comes from this Fragments book, where he's talking about fire. So here we go. Heraclitean fire, it must be insisted, is neither a metaphysical essence like the elements of his peers, nor a spiritual energy, nor a material substance, the fire that burns your hand. His fire is metaphorical, a psychological intensity that penetrates through all literalisms, a quicksilver fire that flows through the hand, burning away whatever tries to grasp reality and hold it firm. This fire, as the active principle of deconstruction, brilliantly deconstructs itself. So that's a little bit of insight into what Heraclitean fire and what he means by that. Now I'm going to skip to the Oxford World Classics version. That was translated in the introduction, was done by Robin Waterfield. And here is what he says about fire and fire's connection to the soul. Given the dominance of fire, it is perhaps not surprising to find that it constitutes and explains the functioning of the dominant part of humans, the soul. He may have inferred the hot nature of soul from the fact that de-animated corpses turn cold. End quote. So this idea that fire, the warmth of a fire, is connected to the soul, whereas when someone dies, that body goes cold. So the idea is that the soul is what kept the body warm. There is a neat connection with or something that Marcus Aurelius quotes, and this. Let me read this. All right, here we go. Always remember Heraclitus's view that the death of earth is to become water, and the death of water to become air, and of air fire, and the reverse. End quote. One, I just think it's cool that Marcus Aurelius was quoting Heraclitus, but then that kind of gets into his view of things, where earth turns to water, turns to air, turns to fire. He holds that there is an eternal world. So it's not just about the here and now, but there is this idea of an eternity or something that lasts, as evidenced by there being a soul. Let me close out this part on fire with one of the fragments. Fire of all things is the judge and ravisher. Now let's go to Logos, and I'm going to read a part from the introduction to the fragments, and this is what it says. An early and abiding influence on Christian thought is famously transparent in the Heraclitean language that opens the gospel according to John. In the beginning was the Word, and that Greek word there would be logos. So in the beginning was the logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So this is what I'm hoping to learn more about over the coming week as I do a deeper dive into Heraclitus's use of the word logos, and then how that was used in the Bible. Let me read another part here. This comes from the Oxford World Classics. There are several recurring themes with Heraclitus. The first concerns what Heraclitus calls the logos and people's incomprehension of it. The logos is something one can hear, and yet it is not simply Heraclitus's own account of things, since he distinguishes himself from it, and it predates his or any account of it. It speaks through him then, and at the same time, it is responsible for events on earth. End quote. So there we get a little bit of an idea of what Heraclitus means when he's talking about the logos. Let me read another part here. His divine logos is like the intelligence of later Greek philosophy, a somewhat anthropomorphized way of explaining the apparent orderliness of the world. End quote. And let me read a few fragments here of Heraclitus about the logos. So the first, this one's a little longer than his other fragments. The word proves those first hearing it as numb to understanding as the ones who have not heard. And let me stop for a second. The word there, the translated word would be logos. So the word or logos proves those first hearing it as numb to understanding as the ones who have not heard. Yet all things follow from the word. Some, blundering with what I set before you, try in vain with empty talk to separate the essences of things and say how each thing truly is. And all the rest make no attempt. They no more see how they behave broad waking than remember clearly what they did asleep. And I'll stop reading there. The next one is, for wisdom, listen not to me, but to the word, and know that all is one. End quote. Here's one other part about the logos, and this is from Hippolytus, who is quoting this of Heraclitus. So the verbal account of the world, which is also fire, truth, wisdom, knowledge, reality, none can stand apart from this fire that allows no objective fixity. All right, stopping there. Those are the three main ideas: flux, fire, and logos. And then there is a fourth idea that is interesting, and I'll just mention this quickly, and that is of the word theos, which would normally be translated as God. And he uses that term, or it shows up 9 different times in the fragments. But it refers to a presence distinct from any mythological person. So he's not talking about the gods of Greek mythology. It's something separate from that. It's a presence distinct from those. And I just kind of find that interesting that he's talking about some sort of God that is outside of the Homeric gods and what we read about in Hesiod and in Homer. All right, now I want to cover a few sayings of Heraclitus that stuck out. And the first is this: wisdom is to speak the truth and act in keeping with its nature. Wisdom is to speak the truth and act in keeping with its nature. Next, I want to cover a couple fragments on resurrection and judgment. And this comes from a quote from Hippolytus. So at first, when I read, this is going to be Hippolytus speaking, and then he is quoting Heraclitus, and then he goes back to speaking, and then he quotes Heraclitus again. So here's Hippolytus speaking. He also speaks of a resurrection in this visible flesh in which we are born, and he knows that God is the cause of this resurrection. He says, and now we're quoting Heraclitus, there they are said to rise up and to become wakeful guardians of the living and the dead. End quote. Now I go back to Hippolytus, and he says that a judgment of the world and of everything in it comes about through fire. For fire, he says, and now quoting Heraclitus again, will come and judge and convict all things. End quote. Here are some other sayings. The path up and down is one and the same. The beginning is the end. The people should fight for the law as for the city wall. Here's another one that I thought was wonderful. Stupidity is better kept a secret than displayed. Maybe that should go above all of our social media feeds. Stupidity is better kept a secret than displayed. Here's another fragment. Always having what we want may not be the best good fortune. Health seems sweetest after sickness, food in hunger, goodness in the wake of evil, and at the end of day-long labor, sleep. Here's another one. To be self-controlled is the greatest excellence, and wisdom is speaking the truth and acting with knowledge in accordance with nature. End quote. That's another translation of that first saying that I said, with the addition of that. To be self-controlled is the greatest excellence. Next one, they follow the popular singers and they take the crowd as their teacher, not knowing that most men are bad and few good. In there, he's talking about following the crowd and what they think and how that's not wise. Here's another one. A man's character is his fate. Another, souls smell things in Hades. Just thought that was an interesting idea, that souls can smell things in Hades. Here is a quote from Aristotle and from Nicomachean Ethics, where he quotes Heraclitus as saying, "The noblest harmony comes from things which differ." It seems like Paula Abdul grasped onto that in her song Opposites Attract. There's a lot of talk about senses, and Heraclitus says the eyes are more accurate than the ears. Here's another one. Applicants for wisdom do what I have done. Inquire within. And I thought that was interesting, just especially if you were to contrast this with the book of Proverbs, where it says the beginning of wisdom, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Here it says, applicants for wisdom do what I have done. Inquire within. Another fragment, to a god, the wisdom of the wisest man sounds apish. Beauty in a human face looks apish too. In everything we have attained the excellence of apes. End quote. So they're just kind of a contrast with gods and the wisdom of the gods or the beauty of the gods, or what we think of as beauty would be as like an ant to humans, and ants talking wisdom or something like that. Here's another fragment. They raise their voices at stone idols as a man might argue with his doorpost. They have understood so little of the gods. End quote. I thought that was interesting. Just kind of he's speaking against worship of stone idols and saying that people who do that, they don't understand the gods. And the last saying here that I want to highlight is this. And this is so good. The reason it is hard to fight against passion is that it buys what it wants at the expense of the soul. Let me read that one again. The reason it is hard to fight against passion is that it buys what it wants at the expense of the soul. All right, let me highlight just a few other things here that I thought were interesting. And as you're going through these fragments and you see who said them, there are so many fragments of early church fathers, and they're referring to Heraclitus's thoughts, and they're even connecting some of them to passages in the Old and the New Testaments. So I thought that was really, really interesting. But here's another one where Clement, one of the early church fathers, connects Solomon to Heraclitus. And so let me read this part. Heraclitus caustically remarks that some people are without faith. And then here he is quoting Heraclitus, not knowing how to hear nor even to speak. And then stopping quoting Heraclitus, but then back to Clement. He was aided here, no doubt, by Solomon. If thou desire to hear, thou shalt receive, and if thou incline thine ear, thou shalt be wise. And that's from Ecclesiastes 6:33. I found that to be interesting. Clement does that quite often here in these fragments, where he'll talk about a verse in the Old or New Testament and then connect it to Heraclitus. Which makes me want to read Clement when I get to that time period in the Immortal Books. All right, a few other items to connect here, and these are kind of third-party books, I guess you could call them. And the first is called Heraclitean Fire, and this is by Erwin Chargaff. And this was a book I read the first year of this reading project in 2017. And it was book 20 for the entire project. And I really enjoyed it. And I want to read a few parts of it. And the first is, this comes towards the end of the book. And Erwin Chargaff says this: while the movers were busy, I stayed at home and browsed around. My eyes fell on a page of Heraclitus, and there he said, the way up and the way down is one and the same. I concluded that Heraclitus was wrong. End quote. And so that the book is called Heraclitean Fire, and that's really the only reference to Heraclitus directly. And he says Heraclitus is wrong. But the idea from this book is that Erwin Chargaff is a scientist, and he's studying in the United States, and he's looking at the direction of science, and he felt that it was going towards a period of too much specialization, to where scientists were becoming arrogant, but they were actually knowing less than they did in the past, and that created this sense of flux, and that was going to consume science. And so that was one thing that he was really concerned about. But the name Heraclitean Fire then is due to this sense of flux that was occurring in the scientific community. However, there's one other part of this book that I found very interesting, because remember at the beginning where I said that Heraclitus kept a copy of his book on nature. He kept a copy in the Temple of Artemis. And I wonder if one of the reasons we lost that is because of this. So let me read it from Heraclitean Fire here by Erwin Chargaff. When the Temple of Artemis, one of the world's wonders of antiquity, went up in flames in 356 BC, a man was apprehended who confessed that he had done it in order to make his name immortal. The judges, in condemning him, decreed that his name must remain unknown. But soon after, the historian Theopompus claimed that the name was Herostratus. Whether this really was the name or whether Theopompus merely wanted to annoy, say, his father-in-law, cannot be ascertained. Recently, when I mentioned Herostratus in an article, the editor called up to say that nobody in the editorial office had ever heard of him, thus giving belated satisfaction to the judges of Ephesus. And I'll stop, or let me read just the next part. If Herostratus has earned immortality for having burned down the temple of Artemis in Ephesus, maybe the man from whom he got the matches ought not to be entirely forgotten. I am that man. That's Erwin Chargaff saying that. But and this was not the point of this section, but I found it very interesting that the Temple of Artemis was burned, and we get this story here of who may have done that. But we actually may have lost one of our main copies of Heraclitus's entire work in that fire, because it was said that he kept his copy there. So now we have the fragments of it, but kind of interesting that connection there. The other place where Erwin Chargaff may have gotten his title for Heraclitean Fire is from a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins. And I want to read this poem. It's interesting. It's called That Nature is a Heraclitean Fire and of the Comfort of the Resurrection. So this is a little long, but stick with me. I think you'll enjoy this. Cloud puffball, torn tufts, tossed pillows, flaunt forth, then chevy on an air. Built thoroughfare, heaven roisterers in gay gangs. They throng, they glitter in marches. Down rough cast, down dazzling whitewash. Wherever an elm arches, shive lights and shadow tackle in long, lashes lace, lance, and pear. Delightfully the bright wind boisterous. Ropes, wrestles, beats earth bare. Of yester tempests creases in pool and rut peel parches. Squandering ooze to squeezed, dough, crust, dust. Staunches, starches. Squandroned masks and man marks. Treadmire toil there, foot fretted in it, million fueled. Nature's bonfire burns on. But quench her bonniest, dearest. To her clearest shelved spark. Man, how fast his fire dint, his mark on mind is gone. Both are in an unfathomable, all is in an enormous dark, drowned. O pity and indignation, man-shape that shone, sheer off, disseveral a star, death blots black out, nor mark is any of him at all so stark. But vastness blurs and time beats level. Enough, the resurrection, a heart's clarion, away grief's gasping, joyless days, dejection, across my floundering deck shone. A beacon, an eternal beam, flesh fade in mortal trash, fall to the residuary worm. World's wildfire leave but ash, in a flash at a trumpet crash. I am all at once what Christ is, since he was what I am, and this jack, joke, poor potsherd, patch, matchwood, immortal diamond, is immortal diamond. That's the end of that poem. So here are the books that I referenced and I looked at for learning about Heraclitus. The first was Early Greek Philosophy, and that is a translation by Jonathan Barnes, and that is a Penguin Classics book. Another Penguin Classics was simply called Heraclitus Fragments, and that translation was done by Brooks Haxton. And And then the third one was the first philosophers, and this covers the Presocratics and the Sophists, and that is a translation done by Robert Waterfield. Again, Oxford World Classics on that one. The fourth book, Heraclitian Fire, and that's the one by Erwin Chargaff that I was mentioning. The next one, Lives of the Eminent Philosophers by Diogenes Laertius, and he collected all of these early philosophers. So I just bought that book. I got that yesterday. That's a Loeb classic version. And there are 2 volumes of that. I got volume 2, which covers more of these early Greek philosophers. And then the last is the major works of Gerard Manley Hopkins. That's a Oxford University Press book as well. So I had fun looking through those, and I'll be referencing the first 3 books I mentioned. I'll be referencing them quite a bit in this process of going through the other early Greek philosophers. All right, those are the main ideas that Heraclitus had from the fragments that we have of him. Next segment, I'll cover my main thing, the one thing about Heraclitus. Well, it's been fun learning about Heraclitus here. The one thing that has stuck out to me the most in reading the fragments of Heraclitus is just how later philosophers and early church fathers kept his fragments alive. It's been interesting to read different fragments of like Sappho or even just how some of the main works that we have are come to us in fragments, or how the Greek tragedy writers, we just have a very few of their complete works, but most of what we have is fragments to where we know what they wrote, but we don't have the full play. And fragments are just so interesting because you don't have that complete work in front of you to where you can understand the whole piece of what has been written, but you have these just little snippets, and I just find it so interesting to read these. But to see what these later philosophers and then these church fathers were attracted to, we get an idea of Heraclitus's main ideas, and then how much he influenced philosophy to where we're still talking about him. I'm guessing you've heard that statement of you never step in the same river twice, because you have changed and the river has changed. The water has flown past. So that's an idea that's still out there, and we still hear a lot about. Yeah, that's the main thing that's stuck out. It's been so fun learning about his ideas, and just that it even helps in thinking to the Plato dialogues that I've read where these ideas are talked about. I have a better grasp about them now. So in conclusion, it was just so interesting to see who quoted Heraclitus and then where those ideas led. And that's the great thing about fragments too, is that you're seeing the quote from Heraclitus, but then you're seeing what this person did with that quote and how they expanded upon that idea or connected that idea somewhere else, and just how famous the people are who have quoted Heraclitus, where you've got Plato and Aristotle, Clement and Marcus Aurelius, and all these different thinkers. The potential connection to the Bible has me very excited, and that will be the focus of my reading for this next week. And then I'll share what I learn in that podcast episode. After that, I'm just going to keep reading about these early Greek philosophers, and then I will share with you what I learn, both on Substack as articles and in the podcast episodes. That's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I'd love to hear from you, especially if you know more about Heraclitus or want to share some other ideas that are famous to him. I'd love to hear that. Best thing would be to just comment on Substack where I post this podcast, because then other people could see that and hear and see what you have written there as well. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter, and go to the website as well, booksoftitans.com. I've got a ton of resources there just to help you find the best books and to create your own reading list. So come back next week. I'm hoping to have part 2 about Heraclitus then, where I focus on his idea about the Logos and how that potentially connects to John, the Apostle John's use of Logos in the Gospel of John. Until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.